I build furniture for a living, custom pieces, mostly dining tables and bookshelves, out of a workshop I set up in the garage of the house I bought the year my marriage ended. That was 4 years ago. The house is in Canmore, Alberta, tucked against the foothills, and I bought it because it had a detached acre with good ceiling height, and because it felt like the kind of place a person could start over without anyone watching. My name is Joel Bancroft. I was 38 years old, and I had not spoken to my ex-wife's younger sister in almost 2 years when she knocked on my door on a Thursday evening in late October, standing in the light rain with a duffel bag over one shoulder and her car parked crooked at the end of my driveway. I recognized her immediately. She looked exactly the same dark eyes, same way of standing, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be somewhere. Her name was Adele. I said her name before I said anything else. She said, "I know I should have called." I stepped back from the door and let her in. I had met Adele the first Christmas after Simone and I got engaged. Simone had spent the whole drive up to her parents' place in Red Deer telling me that her younger sister was going through a difficult phase, that I shouldn't take it personally if she seemed distant, that Adele had always been like that. Private, a little guarded, slow to warm up. What Simone did not mention was that Adele was also one of the sharpest people I had ever met. Or that she had a way of listening to you that made you feel like whatever you were saying actually mattered. We spent 3 days at the Marchetti house that trip. On Christmas Eve, while Simone and her mother were in the kitchen, and her father was watching hockey in the den, Adele and I ended up sitting at the dining room table with a bowl of pistachios between us, and she asked me what I actually wanted to do with my life. Not what I was doing, what I wanted. I was 31 at the time, and working a project management job I had more or less fallen into, and I remember being caught off guard by the question. Most people asked me how the job was going. Adele wanted to know what I wanted. I told her I had always thought about making things. Furniture, specifically. My grandfather had a shop in his basement and I had spent summers there as a kid. She said, "So why aren't you doing that?" I didn't have a good answer. Over the years that followed, Adele showed up at family gatherings the way she always had. Present but slightly at the edges, a little separate from the noise. She was a veterinary technician in Calgary, lived alone, read constantly. She and Simone were not close in the way that some sisters are close. They were cordial, careful with each other. I never asked why. It didn't seem like my place. What I noticed, without meaning to and without saying anything about it, was that Adele was always the one who asked me the real questions. How the workshop was going. Whether I'd finished the commission I'd mentioned 6 months earlier. Whether I liked the neighborhood I'd moved to. Not because she was making conversation, she wasn't a person who made conversation for its own sake. Because she actually wanted to know. I told myself that was just the kind of person she was. My marriage to Simone ended the way a lot of marriages end. Not with a single catastrophic moment, but with the slow accumulation of smaller ones. We wanted different things. We had probably always wanted different things, but we had both believed for a long time that wanting the same things would come eventually, that we just needed to give it time. We didn't have children. That had been a point of friction toward the end, though it was only one of several. The divorce was finalized in March of 2021. We divided things fairly. Simone kept the condo in Calgary. I took some of the furniture and the savings I'd put away. 6 months later I found the house in Canmore and made an offer. I did not see Adele again after the divorce. She texted me once about 2 months after everything was finalized. Just a short message that said she was sorry about how things had gone and that she hoped I was doing okay. I wrote back and told her I was and thanked her. That was the last time we spoke. 2 years passed. I built the workshop. I started taking commissions. Small ones at first and then larger ones as the word got around. By the time Adele knocked on my door in October, I had more work than I could easily manage, a waiting list, and a life that was quiet in a way I had come to think of as mine. I made her tea because it was what she looked like she needed. She sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the dark yard. I sat across from her and waited. She said, "I was engaged. I don't know if you knew that." I hadn't known. I told her so. She nodded. His name was Garrett. We'd been together for 3 years. The wedding was supposed to be in February. She paused. "It's not happening." I said I was sorry. She looked at me then, directly the way she always had. "I didn't come here to talk about Garrett." I waited again. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't my apartment, and I needed it to be somewhere I trusted. She looked back at the window. "You were the only place I thought of." I didn't know what to do with that. I held it for a moment and then I said, "The spare room is small but the bed is decent." She smiled a little. It was the first time she had smiled since she got there. "I won't stay long," she said. She stayed for 6 weeks. The first few days were quiet in a way that surprised me. I had expected it to feel strange, having someone in the house, especially someone connected to that part of my life, but it didn't. Adele was not a disruptive presence. She got up early, made her own coffee, and sat reading at the kitchen table for an hour before she said much of anything. She had taken a leave of absence from the veterinary clinic. She did not talk about Garrett and I did not ask. On the 4th day she came out to the workshop in the morning and stood in the doorway, watching me work on a walnut coffee table I was building for a couple in Banff. I didn't stop what I was doing. She didn't say anything. After about 10 minutes she went back inside and came out again with 2 mugs and set one on the corner of my workbench without a word. It became a pattern. Most mornings she would bring coffee out and then find something to do, reading in the folding chair I kept in the corner, or eventually helping me sort hardware, sand edges, hold pieces in place while I checked the fit. She had good hands and she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She just worked. I found myself explaining things to her without being asked. The grain direction on a particular piece of wood. Why I was using hand-cut dovetails instead of a router. The way you have to think 3 or 4 steps ahead when you're fitting a drawer so that everything lines up the way it should when you're done. She listened the way she always had. About 2 weeks in, while she was helping me go through a box of vintage brass hardware I'd picked up at an estate sale in Cochrane, she said without looking up, "Can I ask you something?" I said she could. "Did you ever think about what you would have done differently?" With Simone. I was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," I said. "Less than I used to." She turned a drawer pull over in her fingers. "I keep trying to figure out the moment where it went wrong with Garrett, like if I could find it I could understand it." She set the piece down. "But I think the truth is it was wrong before I admitted it was wrong, and that's harder to sit with." I nodded. "I understood what she meant," she said. "I think I knew at the engagement party. Something felt off and I told myself it was nerves." She looked up at me. "Have you ever talked yourself out of knowing something?" "Yes," I said. "I spent about 2 years doing that." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I think that's what I was doing with Garrett, and I don't know if the broken engagement is the sad part or the relief part." I didn't tell her which one I thought it was. I didn't think she was asking me to. I should say something about the geography here because it matters. Canmore sits in the Bow Valley, about an hour west of Calgary on the Trans-Canada. The mountains are immediate. You don't have to look for them. They are just there every time you go outside, filling up the whole north and west. In late October, the larches have already turned and dropped their needles, and the light is low and golden for most of the day. It is a beautiful place to be stuck. Adele started taking walks in the afternoons. Sometimes she would ask if I wanted to come. I usually did. We walked the trails along the Bow River mostly, or up into the lower slopes of the Nordic Center. She talked more outside than she did in the house. She told me about growing up in Red Deer, how she had always felt slightly out of step with her family. Not unloved, just not quite fluent in whatever language they all spoke to each other. She told me about the year she had spent working at a wildlife rehabilitation center up near Jasper, which was the happiest year of her life, until she made the practical decision to move to Calgary for the clinic job and the better pay. I told her about my grandfather's shop in Nanaimo, the smell of cedar shavings, learning to read the grain of a piece of wood by running your hand across it the right way. She said, "That's what you should have been doing all along." "I know that now," I said. "You're doing it now," she said. "That's not nothing." Simone called on a Sunday morning at the end of the 3rd week. I was in the workshop when the phone rang. I let it ring twice and then I answered it because I had learned a long time ago that not answering Simone's calls only delayed things, it didn't prevent them. She said, "Is Adele with you?" I said she was. There was a pause. Then she said, "I need you to send her home, Joel." I kept my voice even. Adele is an adult. She came here on her own and she can leave on her own. She needs to be with family right now. She chose where she wanted to be, I said. I think you should respect that. Another pause. Simone's voice shifted slightly. She had a way of doing this, becoming more precise when she was frustrated, clipping the edges off her words. "I understand you two were always friendly, but she is my sister and this is not appropriate." I thought about a lot of things in the few seconds after that. I thought about all the family dinners, where Adele had sat quietly at the edge of things, while Simone and her mother talked over her. I thought about the way Adele had flinched almost imperceptibly the one time Simone had corrected her in front of everyone at a birthday dinner. Small things. Things you only notice if you're paying a particular kind of attention. I said, "I'll let her know you called." I did not tell Adele about the call for 3 days. When I did tell her, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That sounds like her." I said, "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," she said. And then, after a beat, "Thank you for not sending me away. I want to be honest about what was happening in me during those weeks, because it matters to the story, and because I think I owe it the honesty it deserves." I had not let myself think about Adele as anything other than Simone's sister for the entire time I had known her. That boundary had felt important, necessary even, and I had kept it carefully. But she was in my house now, in the mornings at my kitchen table, in the afternoons on the trails, in the evenings sitting across from me while I ate and she read. And she was the same person she had always been, direct and warm and curious and quietly funny, except that now there was no category to put her in that kept everything orderly. I did not do anything about this. I want to be clear about that. I did not say anything, did not change how I acted around her, did not let on that I was turning it over in my mind the way I was. She was there because she was healing from something. That mattered more than anything I was feeling. But I noticed. 5 weeks in, she told me she had taken a contract position at a wildlife center up near Hinton. The same kind of work she had done near Jasper years ago. It would start in January. She would have to find housing up there. We were eating dinner when she told me. I had made a chicken and root vegetable stew, because it was the kind of thing that made sense in November, in the mountains, and she had been the one to find the good bread at the bakery in town. I said, "That sounds like exactly the right thing." She looked at me carefully. "You think? The year you spent near Jasper was the happiest year of your life. You said so, I know." She pulled a piece of bread apart. I've made practical decisions before at the expense of the things I actually wanted. I'm trying to figure out if this is different, or if I'm running away from something." I thought about how to answer that. I said, "I think there's a difference between running away and running towards something. And I think you know which one this is." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about something." I waited. She said, "The night of Simone's bachelorette party, years ago, I didn't go. I told everyone I was sick." She looked down at the table. "I wasn't sick. I just couldn't be there celebrating something I didn't think was a good idea." I looked at her. "You thought the marriage was a bad idea. I thought you deserved better than how she talked about you when you weren't around," she said quietly. "And I thought she deserved someone who wanted what she wanted. And I knew neither of those things was a conversation I could have." The kitchen was very quiet. I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She looked up. "Because I'm leaving in 6 weeks and I think if I don't say it now I'll go the rest of my life not saying it." I didn't respond right away. I sat with what she had said for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only 30 seconds or a minute. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Is that the only reason you came here? Because you trusted this place?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I came here because when I thought about where I felt the most like myself, this was what I thought of." She paused. "And when I thought about the person who had always made me feel that way, it was you." I got up from the table. She watched me. Very still. I walked around the table and I held out my hand. She looked at it for a moment and then she took it. Adele left for Hinton in the first week of January. We spent the weeks between November and her departure differently than the weeks before, more carefully, more fully, paying attention in the way you do when you know time is finite. We drove up to the Columbia ice fields on a clear December Saturday and stood on the glacier in the cold, and it was one of those days that feels like it belongs to you specifically. We had Christmas in Canmore. I made a lamb roast. She brought a bottle of Ontario Riesling she had been saving for something worth saving it for. The drive to Hinton is about 3.5 hours from Canmore, not far by Alberta standards. I helped her move in on a Friday in early January. Her place was a small rented house near the edge of town with good light and a yard that backed onto trees. We unloaded her car and the few boxes she'd shipped, and then we stood in her kitchen in the late afternoon light, and she made coffee and I didn't want to leave. I said I would come back in 3 weeks. She said, "You'd better." I drove back to Canmore in the dark and the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet for 6 weeks. I went out to the workshop and stood in it for a while without turning anything on, just standing in the dark with the smell of sawdust and oil, And I thought about the fact that I had spent most of my adult life being careful. Careful with my feelings. Careful with my choices. Careful not to want things too loudly in case they didn't work out. And I thought about how Adele had sat in my kitchen 3 years earlier and asked me what I actually wanted, and how I hadn't had a good answer. I thought I was starting to. The wildlife center kept her busy through the winter. Injured elk, a pair of orphaned wolf pups that required round-the-clock care for several weeks, the paperwork and logistics of a facility that ran on not enough funding and too much heart. She texted me photos sometimes. A fox kit small enough to fit in 2 hands. The wolf pup's eyes still closed in a pile. A set of moose tracks in fresh snow outside the center at dawn. I went up every 3 weeks. She came down to Canmore when she could manage a long weekend. In April, I finished a dining table for a family in Canmore, and they insisted on a photo. I sent it to Adele. She sent back a voice message saying it was the most beautiful table she had ever seen, and that she was going to need one eventually. And was I taking orders from people she was in love with? It was the first time either of us had used that word. I called her immediately. She answered on the first ring and said, I was wondering how long that would take. Her contract at the Hinton Center was extended through the following spring. By the summer after that, the question of what came next had been answered in the way those questions sometimes get answered, not by a single conversation but by a gradual mutual accumulation of certainty. She moved to Canmore in August. I had cleared out the spare room and built her a proper desk. Maple, with a carved edge detail she had pointed to once in a furniture magazine and said she liked. I set it up while she was driving down, so that when she came through the door, with the first load of boxes, it was already there by the window that looks out at the mountains. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she set down the box she was carrying and turned around. How long have you been planning that? She said. March, I said. She laughed, a real one, the kind that takes over her whole face, and she walked across the room. We have a daughter now. She is 14 months old and she has Adele's eyes, and what I am told is my stubbornness, though I think the jury is still out on that. Her name is Fern, which was Adele's idea, and which I liked immediately. On the weekends I take Fern out to the workshop and sit her in the old folding chair in the corner. The same one Adele used to read in, that first October, and I work while she watches, the same way I used to watch my grandfather, and the light comes through the high windows the way it always has, and the wood smells the way wood always smells, and I am doing exactly what I want to be doing. I knew the second she set down that box and turned around. I think, if I am being honest, I had known for a long time before that.